What would you do if the people you trusted most, your childhood best friends, ganged up and betrayed you? In a quiet suburban neighborhood, for lifelong friends shared everything, secrets, loyalty, and an unspoken code. But when one of them shattered that trust, the others made a chilling decision. Handle it the way their fathers would have. What started as a brotherhood turned into a blood pact. A single act of revenge spiraled into paranoia, deception, and murder. And in the end, no one was safe, not even the ones who thought they were in control. This is the story of the Neighborhood Pact, a crime so shocking, the truth unraveled piece by piece, leading to one final fateful moment. How far would you go to protect a secret? Stick around, because this story will take you deep into the dark corners of loyalty, justice, and the terrifying choices people make when the walls start closing in. If you love gripping true crime stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, let's dive into the crime that shook this small town to its core. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where kids played in the streets until the streetlights flickered on, and where backyard barbecues stretched late into the evening. James, Robert, Travis, and Greg had known each other since childhood, their friendship forged through scraped knees and teenage pranks. But behind the white picket fences and manicured lawns, secrets festered. James sat on his porch, watching the sunset smear the sky with blood-red hues. He swirled his whiskey, the ice clinking softly. His wife, Rebecca, was inside, cooking dinner, acting as if their marriage wasn't rotting from the inside out. James had seen the text messages, late-night whispers, the way Rebecca smiled at Robert when she thought no one was watching. He hadn't confronted her. Not yet. He needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. And when he got it, there would be no forgiveness. That night, he called Travis and Greg. "Come over," he said. "We need to talk." The garage smelled of motor oil and dust, the air thick with unspoken words. James had never felt a silence so loud. Greg leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Travis paced, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Are you sure?" Greg finally asked. James nodded. He slid his phone across the table, the incriminating text glowing in the dim light. Travis exhaled sharply. "Jesus, James. That's messed up." "Messed up?" James' voice was cold. "He's been screwing my wife behind my back." "That's more than messed up." An uneasy tension settled between them. They had shared everything. Secrets, lies, even trouble with the law when they were younger. But this was different. "We fixed this," James said, voice like steel. "The way our fathers would have." A long pause. Then Greg picked up the bottle of bourbon on the table, poured himself a glass, and knocked it back. "I'm in." Travis hesitated. "What exactly are we talking about?" James met his gaze. "We're taking care of Robert." Travis swallowed hard. He looked at Greg, then back at James. Then, slowly, he nodded. The pact was sealed. Robert wasn't a fool, but he trusted his friends. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong when James suggested a poker night. "Been too long since we had one," James said over the phone, his voice smooth. "Like old times." Robert hesitated. "I don't know, man. Rebecca's been busy." James chuckled. "Yeah, I bet she has." There was something in his tone that made Robert pause, but he shook it off. "Fine, I'm in." That evening, James prepared the basement meticulously. He cleaned the floor, moved the furniture slightly to make space. He tested the strength of the zip ties in his hands, pulling until they cut into his skin. Greg brought the rope. Travis showed up pale and jumpy, but he didn't back out. And at exactly 8:30 p.m., Robert knocked on the door. The game started normally. Cards shuffled, chips stacked, beer bottles clinked together in forced laughter. But James was watching, studying. Robert had always had a tell. He scratched his jaw when he was bluffing. And tonight, he was scratching a lot. The conversation turned casual at first. Old times, work, neighborhood gossip. Then James steered it. Ever feel guilty about something, Rob? Robert hesitated, then laughed. What? Like cheating on my taxes? James smiled, but there was no humor in it. No, like something worse. Robert's smile faltered. He looked at Greg and Travis, but neither met his eyes. You betrayed me. The words hung in the air like a noose. Before Robert could react, Greg lunged. It happened fast. Too fast for Robert to process. Greg's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. Travis was on him next, his hands trembling as he held Robert down. What the hell? Robert screamed, struggling. James stood over him, eyes cold. You don't get to play the victim, Rob. Robert thrashed, his eyes wild. James, listen, man. But James wasn't listening. He reached for the hammer. 1. The first blow cracked Robert's skull. His scream turned into a choked gurgle. 2. Blood sprayed onto James' face. 3. The hammer slipped from James' grasp, landing with a dull thud. The basement fell silent except for their ragged breathing. James wiped the blood from his face, exhaled slowly, and looked at the others. No turning back now. The basement reeked of blood and sweat. Robert's body lay twisted on the floor, his head a ruined mess of bone and brain matter. James stared at the body, feeling nothing. No guilt, no regret, just a strange sense of finality. Greg was the first to break the silence. We need to get rid of him. Travis still hadn't moved. He was hunched over, hands shaking. Jesus, man. We actually did it. James grabbed him by the collar and forced him to look at the body. There's no we anymore. There's just what comes next. He expected resistance, panic, maybe even second thoughts. But Greg nodded. We cut him up, burned the pieces. No body, no crime. James knew why Greg was so quick to agree. He had been raised by a father who solved his problems with his fists, a man who taught him that violence wasn't just an option, it was a solution. Travis was different. You knew it had to be done, James said. Now help us finish it. Travis didn't move at first. Then, after a long pause, he swallowed hard and nodded. James turned toward the body. Then let's get to work. They drove in silence. James, Greg, and Travis took Robert's remains to a remote stretch of forest, miles away from town. The kind of place where no one would stumble upon something they weren't supposed to see. They had doused the pieces in gasoline, set them ablaze and waited, but the body didn't burn the way they expected. The fire ate at the skin, curling it, charring it, but the bones refused to vanish. Greg poked at the embers with a metal rod. We need a bigger fire. No, James said. We need to bury what's left. Travis looked sick. This wasn't the plan. James glared at him. The plan was to make him disappear. We adapt. They dug a shallow grave and covered the smoldering remains. The dirt didn't settle right, and James hated how obvious it looked. As they drove back, Travis stared out the window, his face pale. And James knew he was the weak link. James came home just before dawn. Rebecca was asleep, curled on her side. James stood in the doorway, watching her, listening to her steady breathing. She had no idea what had happened. No idea that just hours ago, he had crushed the skull of the man she loved. He walked into the bathroom, stripped off his blood-stained clothes, and stepped into the shower. The water ran red, but no matter how hard he scrubbed, the smell of blood clung to him. When he climbed into bed, Rebecca stirred. You smell weird, she mumbled. James froze. What? She sighed sleepily. Like smoke. James forced a chuckle. Burn some steaks with Greg. Rebecca groaned. You and those guys, always up to something. She rolled over and went back to sleep. James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. If she ever found out what he had done, she wouldn't forgive him. And James wasn't sure if he would let her live long enough to try. Travis was unraveling. He showed up at James' house 3 days later, pacing the front yard like a man on the edge. "We messed up," he whispered. James sighed. "Travis, you need to calm down." But Travis wasn't listening. The grave, it was too shallow. What if an animal digs it up? What if someone finds it? James gritted his teeth. No one's going to find it. But Travis wasn't convinced. "I can't sleep. I keep seeing his face. I think we should tell someone." James' blood ran cold. Greg stepped forward, his voice low. "You don't mean that." Travis looked at both of them, wild-eyed. "We're not murderers, guys. We just made a mistake." James took a slow breath. "We made a decision. And if you think you're going to undo it, Travis, you won't like what happens next." Travis swallowed hard. For a second, James thought he might push back. But then, finally, he gave a small, broken nod. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Good. Now stop acting suspicious." As Travis walked away, Greg muttered, "He's going to crack." James nodded. "And if he does, we fix it." The police knocked on James' door the next morning. 2 officers, standing stiff and unreadable. "Mr. Carter," one of them said. Robert's wife reported him missing. James forced a frown. "Missing? I just saw him a few days ago." The officers studied him. "Where?" James shrugged. "Poker night." The cop took notes. "And after that?" "No idea." James lied smoothly. He didn't seem like himself, though. "Might have taken off." The officer nodded. "Mind if we take a look around?" James' heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he gave them his most disarming smile. Of course not. They didn't find anything. He had cleaned the basement well. But as they were leaving, one officer hesitated. "There's one more thing," he said. "A neighbor reported seeing Travis that night. Says he looked upset." James' stomach twisted. The cop smiled faintly. "Think he might know something?" James forced a chuckle. "Travis? No way. He's just not great under pressure." The cop nodded. "Well, if anything comes to mind, let us know." James closed the door, his hands clenched into fists. Travis was going to break, and James had already decided. If that happened, he wouldn't hesitate to do what needed to be done. James sat in his truck outside Travis' house, watching. Travis had been acting strange, more nervous than usual. When the police left, he hadn't answered his phone. Now, through the window, James could see him pacing. Greg was in the passenger seat, arms crossed. "He's gonna talk." James nodded. "I know." Greg exhaled, tapping his fingers against his knee. "Then we handle it. Before he does something stupid." James turned the key in the ignition. "Let's go." The knock on Travis' door was slow, deliberate. Travis answered, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes flicked from James to Greg, and for a second he hesitated, like he knew why they were here. "Can we come in?" James asked. Travis stepped aside, and as James crossed the threshold, he glanced around. The place was a mess. Empty bottles, takeout containers, clothes scattered across the floor. Travis was falling apart. Greg shut the door behind them. "Locked it." "We need to talk," James said. Travis swallowed hard. "About what?" James stepped closer, lowered his voice. "You know what?" Travis' breathing picked up. I didn't say anything to the cops, I swear." Greg scoffed. "Not yet." Travis backed up until he hit the wall. "Come on, guys. We're friends." James studied him. Friends. They had all grown up together, but that didn't mean anything now. "We can fix this, Travis," James said softly. "But only if you're with us." Travis nodded quickly. Too quickly. James wasn't convinced. Neither was Greg. James and Greg left without hurting Travis. Yet, Greg was furious. "You should have ended it right there." James shook his head. "We give him a chance to fall in line." Greg scoffed. "And if he doesn't?" James didn't answer. He didn't have to. Back at home, Rebecca was waiting. She stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, watching him like she knew something was wrong. "Late night?" she asked. James grabbed a beer from the fridge, popped the cap. "Just Greg." Rebecca didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Travis called me." James froze. Rebecca's voice was quiet. "He said something bad happened." James turned to face her. "Did he tell you what?" She hesitated. "No," she said finally. But he sounded scared. James stepped closer. "And what did you tell him?" Rebecca held his gaze. "That he should go to the police?" Silence. James' jaw clenched. Rebecca took a slow breath. "Tell me, James, what the hell did you do?" James had two options: lie or tell her the truth. He didn't lie. He watched Rebecca's face as he spoke. He didn't tell her everything, just enough. Just enough to make her understand. When he was done, she looked at him like he was a stranger. "You killed him." Her voice was barely above a whisper. James didn't respond. Rebecca took a step back. "Jesus Christ." James held her gaze. "He betrayed me." Rebecca shook her head, tears in her eyes. "You're a monster." James exhaled. He should have felt something: guilt, anger, regret. But all he felt was cold. "Are you going to leave?" he asked. Rebecca hesitated. "I don't know." James nodded. "Then let me make one thing clear." He stepped closer, voice low. "If you tell anyone, I will make you disappear too." Rebecca flinched. For the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. She knew he wasn't bluffing. Travis didn't show up to work the next day. By the afternoon, the cops were back, knocking on James' door. "Mr. Carter," the officer said, "we need to talk." James forced a casual smile. "What's going on?" The officer didn't smile back. "Travis Parker was found dead this morning." James froze. "What?" "Gunshot wound. Looks like a suicide." James felt Greg's eyes on him. The cop studied James' face. "Were you in contact with him last night?" James shook his head. "No." The officer nodded, scribbled something in his notebook. His wife said he was paranoid lately. Kept talking about something he did. Something he regretted. James felt his pulse quicken. The officer tilted his head. Any idea what he meant by that? James forced a frown. Not a clue? The cop studied him for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook. "If anything comes to mind, let us know." James watched him leave, then turned to Greg. Greg smirked. "Well, that solves that problem." But James wasn't so sure. Travis had been scared. Scared enough to kill himself? Or had someone helped him along? James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Travis was dead. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Robert's wife was still pushing for answers. The police were circling. And Rebecca, she hadn't spoken to him since last night. Greg called that evening. "You need to get out of town." James exhaled. "Running makes us look guilty." Greg snorted. "We are guilty." James didn't respond. Greg lowered his voice. "I think Travis talked before he died." James' blood ran cold. "Talked to who?" Greg hesitated. "I don't know, but if the cops find out what we did." James gripped the phone tighter. "We don't let that happen," he said. Greg was silent for a long time. Then, "We might have to take care of one more problem." James closed his eyes. He knew what Greg meant. Rebecca. James sat in his truck outside his house, gripping the steering wheel. Inside, Rebecca was waiting. Greg's voice echoed in his head. "We might have to take care of one more problem." James had never considered himself sentimental. He did what needed to be done. But killing Rebecca, that was different. She was his wife. But she was also a liability. He stepped out of the truck, walked up the porch steps, and opened the door. Rebecca was in the kitchen, wine glass in hand. She looked at him like she had been waiting for this moment. "I know what you're thinking," she said softly. James didn't answer. Rebecca exhaled. "You don't have to do this." James took a step closer. "I can't trust you." Rebecca's hands trembled around the glass. "I haven't told anyone yet." Silence. Then Rebecca's voice dropped to a whisper. "You kill me, James, and they will catch you." James stared at her. She wasn't begging. She was warning him. And for the first time, doubt crept in. He wasn't sure if she was right. James couldn't sleep. Every noise outside made him flinch. Every set of headlights that passed by made his pulse quicken. By morning, he knew something was off. A black SUV had been parked at the end of his street since sunrise. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors. Cops? James watched it from the window, his mind racing. If Travis had talked before he died, the police weren't just looking for Robert now. They were looking for him. His phone rang. "Greg." "They're watching me too," Greg said, voice tight. James clenched his jaw. "We keep our mouths shut." Greg hesitated. "Maybe we should disappear." "No," James exhaled slowly. "That makes us look guilty." Greg was silent for a long time. Then he said, "We are guilty." James didn't respond, because for the first time, he was starting to think Greg wasn't built for this life either. Greg made the first move. James didn't know what the hell he was thinking. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was stupidity. But Greg walked into the police station that night. Didn't confess. Didn't fold completely. But he asked questions. James got the call at midnight. "They brought me in," Greg said, voice shaking. "Didn't arrest me. Just asked things." James gripped the phone. "What did you say?" Greg exhaled sharply. "Nothing. But they know, man. They know he did something." James' stomach twisted. Greg had made himself a target, which meant James was next. James sat on his porch, sipping whiskey. His father always told him that when men like him reached the end of the road, they had two choices: run or fight. James wasn't the running type. The black SUV was still parked at the end of the street, watching, waiting. Greg was crumbling. Rebecca was a wild card, and Robert's wife was still pushing the cops. It was only a matter of time before the walls caved in. James exhaled slowly. He took another sip of whiskey, and he made his decision. The knock came at dawn. James already knew who it was. He didn't run, didn't hide. He just opened the door. Two officers, calm, professional. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." James smirked. "I'd do it again," he said. Then he stepped outside, hands already in the air.